A groundbreaking report reveals that Singapore could get 5 degrees hotter by the end of the century. And along with the heat, a deluge of water from above and below. And for all this, to speak next to Dr Aurel Moise. He's a Deputy Director, Department of Climate Research at the Centre for Climate Research, Singapore. Thanks for coming, Dr Moise.
Good evening.
We've got the figures.
Yes.
It looks like this on paper. What would a day in Singapore look like in 2099?
So a day in Singapore in 2099 very much depends on the emission scenario the world eventually moves towards at the end of the century. As you know, there's 3 different scenarios that we looked at, the low, medium and high emission scenario. So a day at the end of the century depends on which of these scenarios the world comes together. And so in the lower case scenario, we're looking at temperature changes that are only in the order of 1.8 degrees, whereas in the high emission scenario, you'll be looking at temperatures above or near 5 degree changes. And then similarly for rainfall changes, we know the extreme rainfall events will increase under all 3 emission scenarios, but much stronger so for the high emission scenarios. Similarly for sea level rise, which also is under the worst case scenarios up to 1.15 meters, but in the low emission scenarios it stays below half a meter. So it really depends on which emission scenario the world comes together, and Singapore certainly plays its role and is very committed to help.
So you've mentioned a whole bunch of scenarios, sea levels, rainfall, heat stress and all of that, but what you're most concerned about would be the temperature and the heat for Singapore.
Yes, so for what we see in our study as a result is that what we call currently extreme events over the last decade or so will become more of a norm by the end of the century if we move along the high emission scenario. And this is a real concern, and temperature is definitely one of the key concerns with regard to future Singapore climate. As I said, we might be looking at up to 5 degrees temperature changes, and this will project itself to really strong increase in the number of heat stress days, and this is where Singaporeans will feel the heat towards the end of the century if we should move along the high emission scenario and not the medium or low emission scenarios.
Well, that said, Singapore, more than most countries, at least at this point, has the wherewithal to plan ahead and to, I suppose, fund the kinds of infrastructure we need to protect ourselves from these temperature extremes. Elsewhere in the world, small island states, we all know, will suffer from sea level rise first. Yes. Which parts of the world will be most vulnerable to these changes that we talk about? Of course, we're looking beyond Singapore at this point.
Yes, so V3 only looked over Southeast Asia, as you know, and then with a specific focus over Singapore. So we didn't evaluate
Southeast Asia.
Globally. So within Southeast Asia, you have for sea level rise, low-lying delta areas that are particularly vulnerable, and whether this is in the Mekong or in Thailand, the big deltas where there's big cities and then also low-lying areas, and these are particularly vulnerable for sea level rise changes. That is for sure.
But I guess there's also, I mean, as you've mentioned, that Singapore is doing all it can. You're trying to reach net zero targets, but at the same time, we are at the mercy of the rest of the country, at least like around the region. So what then can you say, like ASEAN? I mean, is there anything more that they can do to try and sort of move the needle on this, or is it just based on the economy of a country and how wealthy they are to be able to manage the net zero targets?
This is very much more of a geopolitical than science question. So to me, as not an expert in this area, all I can say is that the negotiations have to lead to some actions, and we've seen COP28 produce some results in that direction, and there should be more in that direction for us to be more hopeful. And I know Singapore is leading the way, in being very committed to both mitigation and adaptation efforts. But the V3 study itself is really not the basis to answer these kind of questions. I'm
afraid the next question sort of touches on that. So the intersection between what we ought to do and what science is telling us we ought to do. What sort of, okay, I won't say it will happen, but in terms of policy recommendations arising from this report, what might they be? How can it help policy? So
for me, our science is really policy advising and not policy descriptive, and this is always one of the fundamentals of IPCC-like science, like V3, and therefore we don't really recommend what policy should be taken given our results. What we do is we present our results and we work very closely with the agencies in the government who then are much closer in determining the policies. So us ourselves, we won't be doing, providing this bridge. So it's actually the policymakers, such as a division inside the ministry, our ministry, who's very much closely aligned with what we do. And we also work with many stakeholders in Singapore and along the way for the last 4 years, so that they understand where the science is leading and what it means for them.
Well, just going back to sea levels, and there's been some stats here going on that of what is of primary concern, that it might rise in the longer term by 2150. To what extent is this worse than what was earlier predicted?
So earlier, so the sea level rise projections coming from V3 are quite similar to what was earlier predicted, slightly higher. And there's a reason for this, because the advancement in the understanding of science of the processes that drive sea level rise globally and regionally and locally has made huge steps forward since the last assessment report. This was one of the key science areas that advanced quite strongly, and therefore the projections now on sea level rise globally, regionally and locally are with much more confidence. The issue with sea level rise is different to atmospheric changes, is that the ocean is the part of the Earth system that changes very slowly but for much longer times. It is the processes that are carrying most of the long-term memory. So even if the world should move towards the lower emission scenario, which will keep global temperatures below 2 degrees by the end of the century, the ocean will continue to warm for many centuries and will continue to expand. And therefore, we already have what we call an unavoidable locked-in sea level rise that will continue to rise in the coming centuries. And this is the difference between the sea level science and projections and atmospheric projections like temperature, rainfall, winds, humidity.
Well, thank you for clarifying so many previously rather ambiguous, vague points. Dr. Aurel Moise from the Centre for Climate Research, Singapore, thanks for coming in this evening.
Thank you very much.